This whole Biden is mentally unfit and should be removed by the 25th Amendment thing, this is a top-line talking point among Republicans right now. This is their big push against Joe Biden, that his cabinet ought to be discussing the 25th Amendment because he is so clearly unfit. And boy, it would be hard to find a more clear-cut case of projection from this Republican Party. Because while no one in Joe Biden's cabinet is even remotely thinking about invoking the 25th Amendment, you know who did discuss it, who considered it quite seriously? Donald Trump's cabinet. Today, ABC News and CNN are reporting that Trump Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has testified to the January 6th investigation in Congress. Trump's Treasury Secretary is probably best remembered as this guy, the one who brought his wife along to the office one day so they could pose with all the money. But another reason, Steve Mnuchin is worth remembering is that he is reportedly one of the cabinet secretaries who opened up discussions about using the 25th Amendment on Donald Trump in the aftermath of the January 6th attack. In his book, Betrayal, about the end of Trump's presidency.
All right, people, welcome back to Jack Mockler. The 25th Amendment is the most dangerous weapon in American politics. A single document that can instantly strip a president of power without trial or congressional vote. Twice during Trump's presidency, his own cabinet held meetings and commissioned legal memos on invoking it, each time stopping just short, with the conversations documented through sworn congressional testimony and insider accounts. The most dramatic moment came after January 6th, when Trump incited a mob to attack the United States Capitol while Congress was certifying the presidential election results. That was the day when the fabric of American democracy nearly tore apart completely. That was the day when Trump's own vice president had to be rushed to safety while rioters chanted about hanging him.
ABC News' Jonathan Karl wrote that according to a source familiar with the conversations, starting the night of January the 6th, quote, Mnuchin talked to other members of the cabinet about attempting to remove Trump from office by invoking the 25th Amendment. Among the cabinet officials he spoke to that night was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Pompeo has denied the conversation, but to this day, Mnuchin has never responded to questions about it. He still refuses to say whether he, on January the 6th, thought Donald Trump might have been mentally unfit to continue serving as President of the United States. The New York Times later confirmed Jonathan Karl's reporting, and January 6th Committee Vice Chair Liz Cheney publicly presented evidence that 25th Amendment discussions had occurred, discussions confirmed by star witness Cassidy Hutchinson.
But the committee has learned that after the attack on the U.S. Capitol, this was being discussed by members of President Trump's cabinet as a way of stripping the full power of the presidency from Donald Trump.
And in the aftermath of that chaos, as the smoke cleared and the nation tried to process what had just happened, Trump's cabinet members began having the most serious conversations of their political lives. They started asking themselves a question that no cabinet has ever had to seriously consider in American history: was the President of the United States fit to remain in office? The answer, for many of them, was deeply troubling. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, who had been one of Trump's most loyal allies throughout the administration, raised the 25th Amendment idea directly with other cabinet members. This wasn't a casual conversation. This wasn't someone venting frustration. This was a senior official.
We understand that this text message that Sean Hannity sent to Kayleigh McEnany on January 7th shows what Mr. Hannity said to the president. First, no more stolen election talk. Second, impeachment and 25th Amendment are real. Many people will quit.
There's a large concern of the 25th Amendment potentially being invoked, and there were concerns about what would happen in the Senate if the 25th was invoked. So the primary reason that I had heard, other than, we did not do enough on the 6th, we need to get a stronger message out there and condemn this, otherwise this will be our legacy. The secondary reason to that was, think about what might happen in the final 15 days of your presidency if we don't do this. There's already talks about invoking the 25th Amendment. You need this as cover.
If Sean Hannity says it, it must be true, right? Again, Trump Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has never answered questions about this. But today he sat down for a transcribed interview with the January 6th investigation in Congress.
Among the most powerful people in the government, proposing the constitutional removal of the president he served. Mnuchin brought it up in actual meetings, with other cabinet secretaries present, and they discussed it as a serious option. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo went even further. Pompeo, who had built his entire career on loyalty to Trump and had been one of his most vocal defenders, commissioned a full legal analysis of the 25th Amendment process. He wanted to know exactly what it would take. He wanted to understand the legal requirements, the timeline, the political dynamics. He wanted to know if it was actually possible to remove Trump from power using this never-before-used constitutional provision. The discussions didn't stop there.
I have a feeling it came up. As for Trump's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, again, he has denied it, or at least an anonymous spokesperson for him has denied it. But reports suggest that now he too may be sitting for a deposition with the January 6th committee before the week is out. And it wasn't just Mnuchin and Pompeo. Trump's Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, who resigned on January the 6th, has said publicly that she too spoke to other cabinet members about invoking the 25th Amendment, and also to Vice President Mike Pence, who shot down the idea. Not for nothing, but this wasn't even the first time that senior members of Trump's administration discussed the 25th Amendment. All the way back in the first year of his presidency, after Trump fired FBI Director James Comey, his Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein reportedly found his behavior so erratic that he too reportedly brought up using the 25th to remove Trump from office. A fact that he took pains not to admit to, but also did not deny when questioned about it under oath. Oh, to be a fly on the wall during Steve Mnuchin's testimony to the January 6th investigation, which is showing no signs of slowing down. Today, Trump's former chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, also met with the congressional investigation. NBC News caught up with him on his way to the interview.
Former FBI General Counsel James Baker testified under oath to Congress that Rod Rosenstein, who served as Trump's Deputy Attorney General, told him something stunning. Rosenstein revealed that at least 2 members of the president's cabinet were willing to support a 25th Amendment action. They were ready to sign the declaration. They were ready to remove the president. And Rosenstein was actively counting votes, trying to determine if there were enough cabinet members willing to go through with it. That's not media speculation. That's not anonymous sources with questionable credibility. That's sworn testimony delivered to Congress under penalty of perjury. That's the kind of evidence that could stand up in any court of law. And it tells us that the United States came incredibly close to invoking the 25th Amendment for the first time in its history.
What you plan to tell the committee today?
The truth? How about that for a start?
And were you asked to come in, or did you volunteer to come in?
I was asked to.
You asked to come in. Subpoena or no?
I honestly just asked to come in.
I was honestly just asked to come in. You'll remember that Mick Mulvaney wore a variety of different hats during the Trump administration, starting off as director of the Office of Management and Budget, to a short stint as Trump's chief of staff, culminating as being the special envoy to Northern Ireland. But the night of the January 6th riot, Mr. Mulvaney resigned his position, telling CNBC at the time that he called up Secretary of State Pompeo and told him, quote, "I can't do it. I can't stay." Mick Mulvaney also recently said that he believes Cassidy Hutchinson and the other former White House officials who have testified. And it is against that backdrop that Mick Mulvaney testified behind closed doors for over 2 hours today. As Vice Chair Liz Cheney recently said at last week's hearing, in fact, new witnesses have stepped forward, doors have opened, and the dam has begun to break.
CNN and other major news organizations reported that cabinet secretaries and senior Republicans were actively discussing the 25th Amendment in real time on January 6th itself. While the Capitol was still under attack, while the mob was still inside the building, while violence was unfolding on live television, the people responsible for running the government were meeting and talking about whether they needed to invoke the Constitution to remove the president who had incited the chaos. That's how serious the situation was. That's how extreme Trump's behavior had become. His own cabinet members, the people who had supported him and defended him for years, were considering whether he needed to be removed from power immediately. They were discussing emergency constitutional measures while the crisis was still happening. But ultimately, they didn't do it. The 25th Amendment wasn't invoked. Pompeo's legal analysis concluded that there simply wasn't enough time left in Trump's term. He had only a couple of weeks remaining before Joe Biden's inauguration, and the process of removing him would have been messy and contentious. Congress would have challenged the removal decision, and that would have taken time. There were questions about whether they could get enough votes in Congress to keep Trump out permanently. The political risks were enormous, and so, despite all the discussions, despite all the legal analysis, despite all the vote counting, they decided not to move forward. They decided it was too late in Trump's term, too risky politically, too complicated to pull off successfully. But the fact that they discussed it at all tells us something profound about Trump's presidency. Think about what it means for a president's own cabinet members to seriously consider removing him from power. These aren't his political opponents. These aren't Democrats trying to undermine him. These are people he personally appointed to run government agencies. These are people who owed their positions to him. These are people who were supposed to be loyal to him. And yet, they were so disturbed by his behavior, so convinced that he was unfit to remain in office, that they started discussing a constitutional mechanism that had never been used in American history. That's not normal. That's not how government typically works. That's a sign that something was fundamentally broken with Trump's presidency. And here's the thing that should terrify every American. The conversation didn't end in January 2021. It didn't go away when Trump left office. It hasn't stayed in the past. The 25th Amendment discussion has resurfaced again in recent months, and it's happening while Trump is once again in the White House. After Trump made threats to wipe out an entire civilization in Iran, after he posted warnings about annihilation and destruction, Democratic lawmakers went on national television and called for his removal. Former conservative allies, people who had supported Trump for years, said his dangerous rhetoric proved he was unstable and unfit to control nuclear weapons. They called on Vice President J.D. Vance and cabinet members to invoke the 25th Amendment and remove him from power. They argued that Trump's threat to destroy an entire civilization showed he was unable to safely discharge his duties as president. The pattern is unmistakable. Trump does something extreme. He crosses a line that no president has ever crossed before. He makes threats that are so dangerous, so outside the bounds of normal presidential behavior, that people inside the government start talking about removing him. The conversation happens in offices and meeting rooms. Legal memos are commissioned. Votes are counted. And then, nothing happens. The mechanism exists, but isn't used. The check on presidential power is discussed but not deployed, and Trump continues to do exactly what he wants. This pattern matters more than any single incident. If this had happened once, you could dismiss it as a momentary panic, a brief overreaction to a crisis. But it keeps happening. After January 6th, the cabinet discussed the 25th Amendment. After Trump threatened genocide against Iran, people started calling for the 25th Amendment again. The pattern is clear and documented. Every time Trump pushes the boundaries further, the conversation about constitutional removal comes back. It's not partisan hysteria. It's not media exaggeration. It's a recurring response to a president who keeps doing things that make his own people question his fitness to remain in office. The 25th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified in 1967 in the aftermath of President John F. Kennedy's assassination. The nation had just watched a president be murdered in broad daylight, and there were serious questions about what would happen if a president became unable to serve. The amendment established a clear procedure for presidential succession. It created a mechanism for handling situations where a president is temporarily or permanently incapacitated. But Section 4 of the amendment is the part that truly matters for removal. It's the constitutional provision that allows the vice president and a majority of cabinet secretaries to declare that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The moment that declaration is signed, power transfers immediately to the vice president as acting president. No congressional approval is required. No court ruling is needed. No lengthy legal process is involved. It's fast, it's decisive, and it's absolute. The framers of the 25th Amendment understood that there might come a time when a president could no longer fulfill his constitutional duties. They understood that the nation needed a mechanism to handle that situation without waiting for the slow and cumbersome impeachment process. They designed Section 4 to be a constitutional emergency brake, a way to remove a president who was physically or mentally incapacitated, or whose judgment had become so impaired that he posed a danger to the country. But here's the catch. If the president contests the declaration and insists that he's actually fine, Congress has to get involved. The amendment requires a 2/3 majority vote in both the Senate and the House to confirm that the president is indeed unable to serve. That's an incredibly high bar. That's a number that's nearly impossible to reach in a divided Congress. That's why the 25th Amendment has never actually been used to remove a president in American history. The procedural hurdles are daunting enough, but the political implications are even more significant. Invoking the 25th Amendment means that the Vice President and the Cabinet are publicly declaring that the president they serve is unfit for office. They're saying that the person they supported, the person they've been working for, is incapable of performing his constitutional duties. That's not a decision anyone makes lightly. It's the kind of decision that can destroy political careers. It's the kind of decision that can trigger a constitutional crisis. It's the kind of decision that requires extraordinary circumstances and an extraordinary amount of courage. And in every instance where Trump's behavior has triggered discussions about the 25th Amendment, the people around him have ultimately decided that they don't have the courage or the political backing to go through with it. The January 6th situation was the closest the nation has ever come to invoking Section 4. When Trump incited a mob to attack the Capitol, when he refused to call off the rioters even as violence was unfolding, his cabinet members started to panic. They realized that the president had become a threat to the constitutional order. They realized that he was actively undermining the peaceful transfer of power. And they started asking themselves whether they had a duty to remove him using the constitutional tools available to them. The discussions were serious and substantive. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin raised the idea with other cabinet members. Secretary of State Pompeo commissioned legal analysis. Rosenstein was counting votes. And the media reported that cabinet secretaries like Betsy DeVos and Elaine Chao were sympathetic to removal, though they had already resigned by the time the most serious discussions took place. The reporting indicates that there was genuine momentum toward invoking the 25th Amendment in those chaotic days following January 6th. Multiple cabinet members were seriously considering it. Multiple legal experts were consulted. The constitutional process was being mapped out. But in the end, the political calculus just didn't work. Pompeo's legal analysis concluded that there wasn't enough time to complete the process before Trump's term ended. The transition to Biden was already underway, and the clock was ticking. Congress would have challenged the removal decision, and the legal fight would have dragged on beyond Trump's departure. There were concerns about whether they could get the 2/3 majority needed to keep Trump out of office permanently, and so they pulled back. They decided to wait it out instead of creating a constitutional crisis. They decided that the risk was too high and the reward too uncertain. But the fact that they got that close, the fact that they were counting votes and commissioning legal memos, shows just how seriously they took the threat Trump posed. They weren't playing politics. They weren't engaging in theatrical opposition. They were genuinely afraid that Trump's behavior was so dangerous that he needed to be removed from office immediately. That's not an accusation anyone makes lightly. That's the kind of judgment that comes from people who have access to the most sensitive information in the government, who see the president up close, who understand the responsibilities and powers of the office. Their willingness to consider removing Trump via the 25th Amendment tells us that they saw something truly alarming in his conduct and judgment. Now, in 2026, those conversations have started again. When Trump threatened to destroy an entire civilization in Iran, when he talked about annihilation and genocide, the alarm bells started ringing once more. Democratic lawmakers appeared on television and called for his removal. Former conservative allies, people who had defended Trump for years, said his rhetoric proved he was unstable and dangerous. They pointed to his threat to wipe out millions of people as evidence that he was unfit to control nuclear weapons. They called on Vice President J.D. Vance and the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment. They argued that Trump's behavior had become so extreme that constitutional intervention was necessary. The threat Trump made against Iran wasn't typical political rhetoric. It wasn't the kind of tough talk that politicians have been using for generations. It was a direct threat to commit genocide. It was a threat to kill millions of innocent people. And Trump posted it on social media, making it public and undeniable. That's the kind of thing that makes serious people start asking serious questions about whether the president is fit to remain in power. That's the kind of thing that triggers constitutional discussions. And it's happening while Trump is currently serving as president, with access to nuclear codes and military power. The parallels between 2021 and 2026 are striking and alarming. In both cases, Trump did something so extreme that people inside and outside the government started discussing the 25th Amendment. In both cases, the conversations were serious and substantive. In both cases, legal experts were consulted and political calculations were made. And in both cases, the mechanism wasn't ultimately used. The pattern keeps repeating itself, and that should trouble every American who cares about the stability of the constitutional system. Here's what makes the current situation particularly dangerous. Trump now has more power and fewer constraints than he did during his first term. The Supreme Court has ruled that presidents have broad immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. That ruling effectively removed one of the key checks on presidential power. Trump also has a stronger grip on the Republican Party than he did before. The people who might have opposed him in his first term have either been purged or have fallen in line. The institutional safeguards that might have restrained him are weaker than they used to be. And yet his behavior remains just as extreme, if not more so. The 25th Amendment was designed to be a check on a president who has become a danger to the country. It was designed for situations exactly like the ones we've seen with Trump, but it's never been used, not once in American history. And the fact that it's been discussed multiple times in connection with Trump, but never actually deployed, raises profound questions about whether the constitutional check actually works. Does it matter if the mechanism exists on paper if no one is willing to use it? Does it matter if the power is there in the Constitution, if the people who are supposed to use it are too cautious or too fearful to act? The pattern that's emerging with Trump and the 25th Amendment is deeply troubling for anyone who believes in constitutional governance. We have a president whose behavior is so extreme that his own cabinet members have discussed removing him on multiple occasions. We have a constitutional mechanism designed specifically for this situation. And we have a consistent refusal to actually use that mechanism. The gap between what the Constitution allows and what political reality permits has never been more apparent. Trump operates with the knowledge that even though people might talk about removing him, they almost certainly won't follow through. He knows that the people around him are too cautious, too political, too afraid of the consequences to actually invoke the 25th Amendment. And that knowledge gives him license to push further and further, to do things that would have been unthinkable for any previous president. The fundamental problem is that the 25th Amendment requires the vice president and cabinet to act against their own president. It requires them to break with the person they serve. It requires them to create a constitutional crisis and to face the political consequences of that decision. Most people in those positions simply aren't willing to do that. They weigh the risks and decide that it's better to manage the situation as best they can, to wait out the crisis, to hope that the president will calm down or that the problem will resolve itself. They're not willing to be the ones who fire the constitutional kill shot. But that unwillingness to act has consequences. It means that the 25th Amendment, for all its power on paper, is effectively toothless in practice. It exists, but it isn't used. It's a threat that's never carried out. And the president knows it. Trump knows that even when his behavior triggers serious discussions about removal, even when legal memos are commissioned and votes are counted, nothing will actually happen. He knows he can push the boundaries as far as he wants, and the people around him will talk, but won't act. That's a dangerous dynamic for any democracy. It's a dynamic that encourages extremism and discourages accountability. The repeated discussions about the 25th Amendment also reveal something important about Trump's fitness for office. His own cabinet members, people who worked with him every day and had access to the most sensitive information, thought he might be unfit. They thought it seriously enough to consider constitutional removal. They weren't making a political statement. They weren't trying to score points with the opposition. They were genuinely concerned that the president they served had become a danger to the country. And that concern has been validated multiple times, across multiple years, by multiple officials. The Iran threat was particularly alarming. When Trump threatened to destroy an entire civilization, he was talking about mass murder on an unimaginable scale. He was threatening to kill millions of people. He was threatening genocide. And he posted those threats publicly on social media for the world to see. There's no ambiguity here. There's no room for interpretation. Trump directly threatened to wipe out an entire people. And when he did that, people immediately started calling for his removal via the 25th Amendment. Democratic lawmakers went on national television and said Trump was unfit. Former conservative allies agreed. They said his rhetoric proved he was unstable and dangerous. They called on Vice President J.D. Vance and the cabinet to act. The threat Trump made against Iran wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern of extreme behavior that has characterized his entire political career. He incited a mob to attack the Capitol. He threatened to destroy an entire civilization. He made threats against political opponents. He attacked the media. He undermined democratic institutions. He praised dictators and autocrats. And every time he did something more extreme, the conversation about the 25th Amendment started up again. What we're seeing is a systemic failure of constitutional checks and balances. Impeachment is supposed to be the primary mechanism for removing a president who commits high crimes and misdemeanors. But impeachment is a political process that requires a two-thirds majority in the Senate, a number that's nearly impossible to reach in a divided Congress. The 25th Amendment is supposed to be the backup mechanism, the way to remove a president who's unfit even if he hasn't committed a crime. But the 25th Amendment requires the vice president and cabinet to act, and they've consistently refused to do so. The result is a president who's effectively above accountability, a president who can do almost anything and know that the people around him will talk but won't act. The Supreme Court's recent ruling on presidential immunity has made the situation even worse. By giving presidents broad protection from criminal prosecution for official acts, the court has essentially removed another check on presidential power. If Trump can't be prosecuted for things he does as president, and if his cabinet won't invoke the 25th Amendment, what's left? What mechanisms exist to hold him accountable? The answer is disturbingly little. The Constitution has checks and balances, but they only work if the people responsible for using them are willing to actually do it. The Founding Fathers understood that power corrupts. They understood that any person in a position of authority would be tempted to abuse that authority. That's why they created a system of separated powers and checks and balances. They built mechanisms into the Constitution to prevent any one person from becoming too powerful. But those mechanisms only work if the people who are supposed to use them actually do their jobs. If the vice president and cabinet won't invoke the 25th Amendment, it doesn't matter that the amendment exists. If Congress won't convict in an impeachment trial, it doesn't matter that the impeachment power exists. What we're seeing with Trump is a stress test of the constitutional system. We're seeing whether the checks and balances the founders created can actually function under extreme pressure. And the results are not encouraging. The system is straining. The mechanisms exist on paper but aren't being used. The people who are supposed to act are hesitating. And the president is exploiting that hesitation. The 25th Amendment remains a constitutional nuclear option that has never been used. It's a weapon that exists but has never been fired. And if Trump's behavior couldn't trigger its use, it's hard to imagine what would. If inciting a mob to attack the Capitol and threatening genocide aren't enough to make the vice president and cabinet act, what would be? What would it actually take? The fact that these conversations keep happening but never result in action suggests that the threshold for using the 25th Amendment is impossibly high. It suggests that no matter what Trump does, the people around him will find reasons not to act. They'll say it's too late, they'll say it's too risky, they'll say they don't have the votes, they'll find excuses because acting is harder than waiting. We're left with a president who has nuclear weapons and a history of extreme behavior. We're left with a president whose own cabinet has discussed removing him multiple times but never followed through. We're left with a president who threatens genocide and faces no accountability. That's the situation America finds itself in, and it's a situation that should concern anyone who values democracy and constitutional governance. The bottom line is this: Trump's behavior keeps triggering serious discussions about the 25th Amendment. His cabinet keeps considering it. Senior officials keep analyzing it. Legal experts keep writing memos about it. But it never actually happens. The constitutional mechanism exists but isn't deployed, and that leaves America with a president whose power is almost completely unchecked. A president with nuclear weapons. A president who threatens genocide. A president whose cabinet discusses his removal but doesn't actually remove him. That's the extraordinary situation we're in. That's what happens when all the normal checks on presidential power have failed or been rendered toothless.